Hello, welcome to another Patreon video. It is summertime, or just about summer. I get to pick up my kid from his last day at school in about a little over an hour, so I wanted to make this video. From here on out, throughout the summer, when I make my videos, I'm going to try to do one a week. When I do it, I'm not going to be projecting as much. I'll probably be getting closer to the camera and keeping my voice down because I'll have to do them at night after my kid goes to bed. So we'll see how it goes. But before I go into like another series, I'll probably over the summer I'll probably pick an older New Testament book and kind of walk you through that, because obviously the point of this Patreon stuff is to get you interested in the work that I'm doing, and the work that I'm doing is hopefully putting together an Old Testament intro book and a New Testament intro book. So as I put those together, I'll share with you what I'm doing. But for today, I wanted to take at least one video to kind of share with you a little bit about what I have done. I talked about it last time, my Christianity and the Revolution and Worldviews in Western Cultures book. I'm not going to go through every single thing. You can read it for yourself. I hope you do. But I thought I'd share today just one specific thing that I mentioned in the book that really actually got me interested in this whole idea of culture and civilization long before I even taught it. I didn't realize this. But in the late 90s, when I was still in California, I came across, I think it was on some cable show, Terry Jones of Monty Python. He actually has a master's degree in history, and he did a number of videos for the BBC called Medieval Lives. And you could go on YouTube and you can find them. Type Terry Jones Medieval Lives. And I think all in all, there's a total of like 8 episodes where he goes through various aspects of the Middle Ages and focuses on the philosopher, the monk, the maiden, all these stereotypes we have about people in the Middle Ages. And he actually goes through and he dispels a lot of wrong information that we in the modern world assume about the Middle Ages. And I remember watching those things, and not only were they funny because he did it in a kind of a Monty Python way, but they were just really interesting. And it started getting me to just have a whole different perspective on the Middle Ages. And then later on, when I started teaching at the high school here, and started putting together a worldview class, those impacted me, as well as a number of books that I read that I mentioned here at the beginning of my book. Most notably, Rodney Stark's Triumph of Christianity. It just revolutionized my way of understanding the past and the church and Christian history and all that stuff. So anyway, what I thought I'd do today is share with you a little bit of our misconceptions of the Middle Ages and what really went on. And so let's just get into it. Like I said in my last video, one of the misconceptions we have in the modern world is of the Middle Ages, the medieval period, the Dark Ages. And where we got those titles from, those category titles from, was actually from basically propagandists during the Enlightenment, people like Rousseau and Voltaire. And they hated Christianity and the Catholic Church so much that they basically went on a propaganda campaign in all their writings, and they were basically saying all the previous 1,000 years of history in which the church had a lot of influence, they were just all backwards, stupid, superstitious idiots. But now that we have science and reason will take us into enlightenment. Never mind the fact that, the rise of science happened precisely because of monks and priests throughout the Middle Ages, but nevertheless, that propaganda campaign kind of took hold, and even people today, most people today, that's how they view the past. The classical age of Greece and Rome, which is all awesome, look at all the cool statues in the Colosseum, etc., etc. And then Christianity, Middle Ages, and then finally the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, kind of pulled us out of that religious junk. Yay! That's kind of the stereotypical way people view history. Well, that's just not true. And so, what you have to understand about what we call the Middle Ages is what was actually going on. And here it is in a nutshell. The Roman Empire was pretty vast. When Constantine became the emperor and became a Christian, he moved the capital from Rome, which was in the west, to Constantinople in the east. And the effect was all the money and power and wealth and all that stuff moved out east to what is today Turkey and that area. And basically that left Rome and Western Europe kind of out to dry. It became kind of a backwoods, wilderness area. And because paganism itself kind of dwindled, because it was so morally bankrupt, all the glory was happening out east. Out west, it was just like the wild, wild west. And the only people who were left to try to organize it into something and to build it back up was the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, and monks and nuns. And so for hundreds of years, monks like Benedict, Francis, they started monastic orders, moved out throughout Europe, kind of in the wilderness almost, and they just started rebuilding Western Europe from the ground up. And because it was devastated by paganism and all the money and power had left. And so what you have to realize is the reason why it was so dreadful initially was because politically everything had moved and paganism had kind of wrecked everything. But throughout the Middle Ages, these monastics and nuns, they were doing things little by little. They were planting seeds that eventually flourished later on into what we know as the scientific revolution and the Renaissance. Basically, those things were not antithetical to what was going on in the Middle Ages. Those were the full fruit of what the monks and nuns were doing in the Middle Ages. But I just want to point out a couple of things specifically. In the 8th century, you might have heard of a guy named Charlemagne. He was basically the first ruler in almost 400 or 500 years in the West that actually consolidated power and was able to kind of put things together. And he's known for what is called the Carolingian Renaissance. We don't hear about that, but it happened in the 8th century. And basically what he did is he established schools and learning throughout Western Europe. He had liberal arts schools, and he in which they taught grammar and logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, and he hired monks and nuns to teach children in their districts, basically have school for children in their districts. So the very basis for education during the Middle Ages happened because of the church. That's the first thing. Now let's look at the specific monastic orders. One of the reasons we've actually had an eventual scientific revolution and Renaissance was because during that time, it was the monks like Benedict who in their monasteries, they preserved thousands and thousands of ancient texts from Greco-Roman times and Byzantine times. They preserved all this learning, and they didn't have copy machines, so they kept on rewriting it. Copies and copies and copies of all this ancient learning that was available to people as they eventually got educated and were able to read Greek and Latin and stuff. It was because of that eventually the Renaissance and scientific revolution happened. But not only did they preserve learning, what they did in their monastic centers, their monastic orders, their estates, is they viewed themselves, because they were monks and priests and nuns, they viewed themselves and the created order in a very biblical way. They viewed that human beings, them in particular, were co-regents of God's good creation, and they had a vocation to take care of it and, to educate his image bearers, the other, people, pagans even, and to take care of the created order. And one of the things they were doing in their monastic estates, they weren't just sitting around praying all the time, they were working. That's another thing that they really emphasized. In ancient Rome, the people who did manual labor were slaves, who had no dignity. one of the things these monks and nuns preached was that human beings in the image of God, there is dignity in manual labor. And they worked crazy like. And because they wanted their monastic estates to be self-sufficient, they developed technologies to make their work more prosperous, more efficient. And that stuff that was happening in the monastic estates gave rise to so much stuff we just take for granted in the modern world. For example, one of the things that the Catholic Church did throughout the Middle Ages, the monks and nuns, is they established hospitals for not just the rich people who could afford them, but for the poor. They were the ones who stayed behind in times of plague to care for and minister to the people affected by the plague. Why? Because they were made in God's image and they deserve to be cared for. And so basically, our very notion that hospitals should be made available to everyone comes from the monks and the nuns of the so-called Dark Ages. They also established universities. It kind of came from the Carolingian Renaissance. They eventually established universities. And little as you might not know this, but like 1/3 of the curriculum in Middle Age universities were devoted to the sciences. Not only the sciences, but they also made tremendous progress in the area of philosophy. Thomas Aquinas, the Dominican monk, was considered one of the greatest philosophers of all time, where they were wrestling with the implications of Plato and Aristotle and what that meant within the context of a Christian worldview. But also, because they were trying to be self-sufficient in their estates, they basically, without calling it capitalism, they developed the market economy, free markets. What they would do is they would, because they wanted to be self-sufficient, they would make their own wool, they would make their own wine or beer or cloth. And because they developed technologies to make it go more efficiently, the surrounding people, the pagans, wanted to get in on it because it was making their lives better. And a lot of these monastic estates eventually evolved into small towns, into cities, into major production centers. And that is what rebuilt what had been a broken down Western Europe because of ancient paganism, and they rebuilt it from the ground up over hundreds of years. So it just blew my mind when I first realized that things we take for granted, hospitals, universities, free markets, that we just take for granted, came about because for hundreds of years, nameless monks and nuns throughout history slowly built these things up. Anyway, that is just a little bit of what blew my mind about what we call the Middle Ages. And it is fascinating to learn about Christianity's influence in the last 2,000 years of church history. It blows away so many misconceptions we have. And like I said, it's just fascinating. I loved writing the book. It was really interesting. And I hope you get it. If you got it, I hope you read it and enjoy it. Heck, please, if you do, go on Amazon.com and write a glowing book review. So the more reviews I get on Amazon.com, the higher up and more profile it gets. So anyway, next week I'm going to go back to taking you through certain biblical books. If you really are burning to know about one, send me an email and tell me which one you want to do. I'm working on them all in these books that I'm writing, so I can touch upon anything. So, but if I don't get any responses, I'm going to choose one for myself, and we'll go through the next month or so, taking you through some of the stuff I've learned about certain books of the Bible. All right, thank you very much. Happy summer.